Hey guys, I hope you all are doing well. I hope you're healthy. We're now in week 6 of NTI. I'm pretty sure it's going to be day 28. Moving forward in terms of talking about the different places within the earth in terms of geography, we're going to talk about Russia today, one of the largest countries and areas within the world. So let's get started. So when you talk about Russia, if as you can see, it makes up a huge landmass, and in addition, it used to be even larger when you had the Soviet Union, and it had control of the smaller countries like Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, a lot of the countries that end in stan over in this area, and then you had Belarus and Ukraine up here. Moving on, again, I talked about how Russia is one of the largest, not only countries, but areas that we're going to talk about within these notes. And the first thing we're going to talk about is its size. So, Russia is the largest country in the world at 6,595,600 square miles. In comparison, the U.S. is barely like half of that. So the U.S. is 3,718,711 square miles. So a huge, huge land area. We talked about how Canada was even larger than the U.S. At 3,855,103 square miles. So you can just see from those numbers how large Russia is. It's pretty much twice the size of the North American countries that we've talked about. And it covers 11 different time zones. So if you think about in one country, 11 different time zones, that's a vast amount of land area, and can, if you think like in the U.S., we have like 3 or 4 time zones. So if you think how crazy it would be to have 11 in one country. So let's talk about bodies of water within Russia and near Russia. So you have the Caspian Sea, which is a salt water. It's salt water, and it's the largest inland sea in the world. The Aral Sea, salt water as well, decreasing in size, and we will talk about that later as why it's decreasing. And then Lake Baikal, it's the deepest lake in the world. It's more than 1 mile deep. 20% of the world's fresh water is within that, and it's home to the world's only freshwater seal. So that's some very interesting facts about the bodies of water that make up Russia. Here's an image of Lake Baikal. Russia does have beautiful landscapes within its vast amount of land area. The Aral Sea, you can see dry sands. You can see some shipwrecked boats that have gone shipwrecked throughout the years in this sea. And then here's an aerial view of the Caspian Sea. When we talk about Russia, natural resources is something that comes up. The question always is why is it so difficult to remove resources from the ground in Russia and transport them to the markets? Well, it's because Russia does have beautiful landscapes, but a lot of Russia is frozen. It's subarctic, it's tundra, especially in the Siberia area. So many of their natural resources are located in frigid Arctic and subarctic regions of Siberia. Businesses find it difficult to attract workers to severe conditions in regions like those. Temperatures rarely get above 50 degrees and sometimes drop below negative 90. The whispering stars is when you exhale, your breath freezes into crystals that fall to the ground and make a noise. So it's so cold in those areas that even breathing, the air you breathe because of the moisture that comes out, it freezes. So that is one reason that Russia, it has a lot of natural resources, but struggles to get them from the ground to market because of those severe, low climate regions. Here's an aerial view of Siberia. As you can see, it's pretty. I'll go back. It's pretty much all. Frozen. I don't know why we're not going back. We're going forward. Frozen, as you can see from here. Not much going on in terms of human activity. Here is the Yenisei River in Siberia. It completely freezes over in the wintertime. Here's the river right here. As you can see, completely frozen over and snow covered. So, moving on to human environment interaction, and we talked about the Aral Sea and why it's shrinking. So, between 1960 and the present, the Aral Sea has lost about 80% of its water. And we saw those shipwrecked boats and how you can see them now because the water is just disappearing. And so, the question is why? Well, human environment or interaction that we've talked about when we talked about the 5 themes of geography. There's 2 rivers that feed into the Aral Sea, the Daria and the Sirdaria. I probably butchered those pronouncings, but just bear with me. In the 1950s, the government began to take large amounts of water from those rivers to irrigate the Central Asia's cotton fields. So pulled water from those 2 rivers that ran into the Aral Sea to irrigate water into these the Asian cotton fields down here. So pulled that water to irrigate Asian cotton fields to make money that way. The water that flowed into the Aral Sea then began slowly to come to like almost like a trickle. So not much water is coming into the sea. Because of that, it begins to evaporate. And that's when you get those just that bare, dry, almost desert-looking ground that used to be covered by water. Here's the waterfront in quotations because the water's pretty much gone except in some little pockets right here of the Aral Sea in Kazakhstan. So this used to formerly be the banks of the Aral Sea. And as you can see now, it's just kind of like barren field land. You have abandoned ships that were formerly like at the bottom of the Aral Sea near Kazakhstan. Here's one, and we kind of saw an aerial view of some earlier. So look how drastic this is. So over here you have July through September of 1989 and how much water there was in the Aral Sea. And then due to that human environmental interaction of the irrigation to farmland for those cotton fields, in October 5th of 2008, this is what the Aral Sea looks like now. So a drastic change. Even at the deepest parts right here, you can tell there's barely any moisture left. And then you have some pockets up here. Effects of agriculture. Oops. Come on. Cotton growers used pesticides and fertilizers due to runoff, so rainwater that came and would hit those crops and then run off into different water supplies, carried the chemicals into the rivers that fed into the Aral Sea. Only of the 24 native species once found in the sea, in the Aral Sea, none are left today. So of 24 native species of fish, marine life, and things like that, that depended on those rivers and the Aral Sea, none of those are left today because of that human environmental interaction and the irrigation of those cotton fields and then the subsequent chemical runoff from those cotton fields as well. Hopefully from that, and then from this we'll talk about the health effects. You see that that human environment interaction was probably needed at the time and seen as a necessity to help those cotton fields both economically and agriculturally, but there are consequences that we don't necessarily think of, and we don't see the whole picture and we think about the long run, and we saw those consequences where the native life in the rivers and sea, the Aral Sea, have died. Now we look at health effects of the Aral Sea. The retreating water has now exposed those fertilizers, pesticides, and salt. As a result, windstorms, because now you have that dry, barren land, so you have windstorms that are very common. They pick up and deposit and dump those fertilizers, pesticides, and that salt that's now just exposed out on those barren fields, and they dump it on nearby populations. So you think, back in the late 80s, you were living next to a nice sea. Now you're getting pesticides and stuff dumped on you from windstorms in today's climate, in today's effects of those causes that we talked about earlier. Because of this, it led to an increase in diseases. You have throat cancer and respiratory diseases that have become very common in the populations near this area. saving the Aral Sea. So to keep the lake at its present levels, they would have to remove 9 of the 18 million acres that are now used for farming. So essentially, they would have to remove half of the acres of that are now used for farming. Well, how would that affect the farmers? Because you think about, well, what are the effects of trying to revert back to and restoring that natural resource of the Aral Sea? If nothing is done, the Aral Sea could be gone in 20 to 30 years. And that's a question you have to think about, like I said, is how would that affect the farmers? But if nothing is done, you have a whole entire sea. You'll have species, people that'll be affected, gone in 20 to 30 years. So what's the solution? There probably isn't one catch-all solution like you guys have probably learned, in this class and in civics and all your other classes. So now we talk about World War I and its effects on Russia. Nicholas II, who was the last Tsar, there's a Netflix show called The Last Tsar that is really good. I really highly recommend it. He led his country into this World War, and they were very unprepared and unorganized, and they talk about that in the Netflix show as well. He had bad generals. He was plagued by problems at home, and he was really manipulated, and his family was also manipulated by Rasputin, who's down here in this picture. This is Tsar Nicholas, the last Tsar. Many of the soldiers died unnecessarily because of those factors. And in 1917, the White Revolution began. The whites, as they were known, wanted to set up a form of democracy. And Russia ended up pulling out of World War I because of all the issues it was causing at home. And then by October, the Bolsheviks, who were the Reds, had taken power, and a civil war ensued within Russia, and it devastated Russia. And in fact, the Tsar and his family were... the palace was stormed, his family was executed, and then you have the conspiracy theory of one of his daughters got away, Anastasia, and there was a cartoon made about it and things like that. So moving on to number 6, the Soviet Union is formed after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Civil War within Russia, and the last Tsar and the overthrowing of the Tsar and things like that. So by 1921, the Bolsheviks had won the Civil War, led by Vladimir Lenin. I'm sure you all have heard of Lenin. The next year, they set up the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, or the Soviet Union. By the mid-1920s, a new leader had come to power within that group, Joseph Stalin. And I'm sure everybody's heard of Stalin because he'll be the leader of Russia as we go into World War II. So here you have Lenin. This is what he looked like. Stalin continued. So Stalin ruled from 1924 to 1953. He made the Soviet Union into an industrial power and even a world power as well. However, Stalin does get a pretty bad rap because of what this last one. He deported many millions of Russians, sending them to labor camps in Siberia where most of them died. I think Stalin is a leader that is attributed with killing like some of the most people in history. Like you think like Hitler, Stalin, and then other leaders that have killed like many people. He is up there. Here's another picture of Joseph Stalin. And so then we move into World War II. During World War II, because of poor leadership and undertrained troops, millions of Russians died unnecessarily in that war as well. The USSR was the main reason that the Allies won, however, because, and you've probably learned this in another history class, but a quick brief rundown. The USSR originally was with the Axis powers, with Germany and Italy and Japan. However, it was on the contingency that Germany didn't invade Russia, because at that point Germany was like on the Russian border. They had like invaded most of Western Europe, and so they were on, or most of Eastern Europe, excuse me. So they were on like the Russian border, and Russia said that they would, stay and fight with the Germans as long as the Germans didn't invade Russia. Well, of course, Hitler being Hitler and wanting all the power, he eventually did invade Russia, and so Russia flipped joined the Allies, the United States, Great Britain, France, and pretty much the rest of the world. And so then the Germans and the Axis powers were having to fight on two fronts. So they were fighting the Americans, the French, and the British, who were invading and fighting the German power on the Western Front. And then now they had to fight the Russians on the Eastern Front. So it split up the German army and the Axis army. And that's why the Soviet Union was a big reason, and probably one of the main reason why the Allies won the war. Most historians agree that during Stalin's reign, a whole generation was killed from the purges, deportations, and World War II. So like I said, he is attributed with pretty much being the cause of a lot of people dying. Then, right after World War II, you had this struggle that would become known as the Cold War. And that struggle was who was going to be the dominant world power coming out of World War II. Because I told you guys I'm sure we talked about this in civics, we weren't a world power, the U.S., until after World War II. And so the Cold War was a struggle of who was going to be the world power. Was it going to be the U.S. or was it going to be Russia? And it's called the Cold War because there wasn't any fighting. So after World War II, a Cold War ensued between the Soviet Union and the United States, and it was an ideological war, but it was fought through other smaller countries. So you had the war peaking in the 1960s, and it was over by the end of the 1980s with Reagan. But in terms of it being fought in other countries, that is where you have like the Vietnam War and the U.S. trying to contain the spread of communism. Another big part of the Cold War is also the space race, which is huge in terms of affecting economies, geography of that time. Number 9, we have the shift to democracy in Russia. So one of Reagan's big things was he was trying to get Russia to, get away from communism. So in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev took power, and he had a lot of reforms that he wanted to get through. By 1990, countries started breaking off from the USSR, forming their own independent states. So at the very beginning, when I showed you that map of the Soviet Union, I talked about the Soviet Union included Russia and a bunch of other countries. Well, in the 90s, these countries started breaking away. In the 1991, the Soviet Union had free elections, which was really big. Boris Yeltsin was elected and helped create a free capitalistic democracy. Today, the current president is Dmitry Medvedev. That is outdated. The current president of Russia now is Vladimir Putin. He took power from Medvedev. Mikhail Gorbachev, you see a picture here of him, and then a picture here of him and Reagan. Him and Reagan had quite a few meetings throughout Reagan's presidency and throughout this time, trying to discuss, Russia transitioning from the Soviet Union to a more democratic state. Here's Boris Yeltsin, the first president. And then this part is up to date. Vladimir Putin, the current president. And he's the one everybody hears about now as well. 10, let's talk about culture. So language throughout Soviet period, Russia was the official... Throughout the Soviet period, Russian was the official language taught at all the schools in the Soviet Union. So if you think even in like Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, all those countries I talked about that end in stan, Russian was being taught throughout all of those schools. Today, you have like hundreds of languages that are being spoken now because those countries have broken off from Russia. And you have people that have moved into Russia from those countries. So now you have... hundreds of languages being spoken in such a vast country. They're either Slavic or of Turkish background. Population. Russia and the republics have 280 million people, so a vast amount of land, but their population is very large as well. but you would think it'd be a little bit larger. But 280 million people, and the population of Russia and Eurasia, which is like a mix of Europe and Asian countries, has remained fairly constant over the past decade. Religion, so you have forms of Christianity, mainly Eastern Orthodox. You have some Islam in the country. It's the second largest religion in the region. A lot of it coming on those western parts where you have where you had a lot of that influence from those countries that ended in Stan. Judaism, so many Jews have lived throughout in the region over the time. Through pogroms and other forms of persecutions, many have moved away though. So you have had persecution of Jews within Russia as well. Then you have a non-religious group. There is a large number of people due to the fact that during Soviet rule, religion was outlawed. So you do have a lot of people who are still not religious within Russia. And that's the end of that slide, guys, about Russia. So hopefully you got took a lot away from that. I hope you took notes, because you will have a comprehension check over these that you should do next. So I hope you guys are doing well. Hope you're healthy. Again, like always, if you need anything, let us know. Missed you guys. I'll talk to you soon.